The rain falls heavy over the jungle canopy of New Guinea. It is late 1943. Humidity clings to everything: skin, steel, breath. In a shallow foxhole carved into mud and roots, a US Army gun crew waits in silence. Their weapon rests on a low tripod, its dark steel already warm despite the night air. The M1919 Browning machine gun across the clearing, movement flickers between trees. Not seen, only sensed. A whisper of boots. A snap of bamboo. Then stillness again. Suddenly, the silence breaks. A burst of fire tears through the jungle. Not the long roar soldiers expect, but sharp, violent cracks. Each impact explodes against wood, earth, and flesh with unnatural force. Japanese infantry freeze. Men who had faced artillery and naval guns hesitated. Some later whisper a name for what they heard that night: Reiko no Kikai. The thunder machine. This was not a new weapon. But something about how it was being used, and what was being fed into it, changed everything, and in that moment, the nature of jungle warfare shifted forever. By the time American forces began pushing deeper into the Pacific, the war had already transformed into something brutal and personal. The early months of 1942 had shattered illusions on both sides. The Japanese Empire, riding the momentum of Pearl Harbor, had carved a fast-moving arc across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines fell. Singapore collapsed. Wake Island burned, but by mid-1943, the tide was no longer flowing in one direction. The United States had learned, painfully and quickly, that European battle doctrine did not translate cleanly into the jungles of the Pacific. Visibility was measured in feet, not miles. Artillery often couldn't be aimed. Tanks bogged down. Radios failed under rain and mud. And infantry, alone, sweating, frightened, became the true deciding force. The jungle changed everything. Japanese defensive doctrine thrived in this environment. Units avoided large frontal engagements. Instead, they relied on concealment, infiltration, and sudden close-range violence. They dug spider holes barely visible from above. They moved silently through terrain that punished the unprepared. They attacked at night, often at point-blank range. For American soldiers, the psychological strain was immense. The enemy was rarely seen before firing. And when contact happened, it was sudden, violent, and intimate. By 1943, the US Army and Marine Corps were adapting. New tactics emerged. Small unit coordination improved. Air and naval gunfire supported land advances more precisely. But one reality remained constant. Firepower at the squad level could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. This was where the M1919 Browning machine gun entered its second life. Originally designed during the First World War, the M1919 was an air-cooled, belt-fed .30-06 machine gun. Reliable, rugged, mechanically simple. It lacked the raw intimidation of the water-cooled M1917, but it could be carried forward with infantry, and that mattered. By World War II, multiple variants were in service. The M1919A4 for ground use, the A5 for vehicle mounts, the A6 lighter and adapted for mobile infantry support. Its cyclic rate hovered around 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Not excessive, but consistent, predictable, controllable, and in the jungle, control mattered more than volume. Yet the weapon alone was not what altered the battlefield. It was what soldiers began loading into it. Standard .30-06 ball ammunition was effective, but in dense foliage it often passed cleanly through leaves, branches, and sometimes even enemy positions without immediate stopping power. Traces helped with aiming, but they revealed position. Armor-piercing rounds existed, but targets were rarely armored. What commanders needed was shock. Instant suppression. A psychological edge. This led to experimentation, unofficial at first, with mixed belts of ammunition. Ball rounds interspersed with traces, armor-piercing, and in rare cases, explosive or incendiary-type projectiles designed originally for aircraft use. These rounds were never intended for sustained ground fire, and doctrine did not formally approve them for jungle infantry use. But the Pacific War was not fought by doctrine alone. It was fought by necessity. When such rounds struck trees, sandbags, or wooden bunkers, the effect was immediate and violent. Bark exploded outward. Fragments turned lethal. The sound was different, sharper, cracking, almost metallic. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to identifying weapons by sound, noticed the difference quickly. This was not a standard machine gun. This was something else. Reports from the field began to mention an American gun that burst on impact. One that shattered the cover rather than simply punching through it. One that made hiding impossible. The psychological effect was profound. For US troops, it offered a rare advantage, a way to dominate ground without seeing the enemy. For Japanese units, trained to endure bombardment and close assault, it introduced a new uncertainty, and in the humid jungles of New Guinea, Guadalcanal's aftermath, and later the Philippines, that uncertainty grew into fear. Because once the M1919 opened fire with those rounds, there was nowhere to hide, and no way to predict the next impact, and this shift in battlefield dynamics would soon reshape how both sides fought. By late 1943, the Pacific War had evolved into a contest of endurance, adaptation, and psychological dominance. The Japanese Imperial Army still possessed discipline and cohesion, but it was increasingly isolated. Supply lines were strained. Reinforcements were irregular. Food, medicine, and ammunition became precious commodities. Yet morale remained stubbornly high. Driven by doctrine that emphasized sacrifice over survival, American commanders understood this mindset well enough to know that traditional fire superiority alone would not break it. What mattered was shock, the sudden disruption of expectation. Something that could fracture discipline in seconds. In this environment, battlefield innovation did not come from laboratories or official manuals. It came from frontline improvisation. Gunners experimented with belt compositions. Ordnance officers quietly allowed deviations. Combat necessity overruled regulation. Aircraft-grade ammunition, including incendiary and observation rounds, began to find their way into infantry belts, not in large quantities, but enough to change the effect of a burst. These rounds were originally intended to mark targets or ignite fuel in aircraft, not to be fired into jungle terrain. Yet when they struck wood, earth, or packed soil, the results were startling. Instead of a clean puncture, they produced flashes, splinters, and concussive impacts. The jungle itself seemed to erupt. For Japanese soldiers trained to use terrain as protection, this created a deadly paradox. Cover became a liability. Trees shattered. Logs burst apart. Trenches filled with fragments. The jungle, once their ally, turned hostile. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese after-action reports and post-war interviews describe confusion when facing American automatic fire that behaved unnaturally. Some believed new weapons had been deployed. Others assumed artillery was firing at impossible angles. The nickname that emerged, loosely translated as Thunder Machine, was not official doctrine, but a soldier's expression of awe and fear. It reflected not just the sound, but the unpredictability. Thunder does not need to be seen to be feared. From the American perspective, the M1919 became something more than a support weapon. It was a psychological anchor. Gunners knew that when they opened fire, they were not merely suppressing, they were shaping the battlefield. Infantry units maneuvered behind its rhythm. Officers planned advances around its fields of fire. Training adapted accordingly. Gunners were taught to fire in controlled bursts, to walk their fire across suspected positions, and to exploit the panic caused by sudden explosive impacts. Spotters learned to read the jungle, disturbed leaves, unnatural shadows, broken foliage, and guide fire with hand signals rather than radio, which was often unreliable, yet this effectiveness came at a cost. The modified ammunition increased barrel wear. Overheating became a serious concern. Crews had to rotate barrels, regulate bursts, and manage ammunition carefully. A mistake could mean a jam, or worse, a catastrophic failure. Despite these risks, the tactical advantage was undeniable. The M1919, once seen as merely a support tool, became a focal point of engagements. This shift coincided with broader changes in Allied strategy. Island-hopping campaigns aimed not to conquer every position, but to neutralize Japanese strongholds by cutting supply lines and isolating garrisons. In these operations, speed and shock mattered more than occupation. Machine guns that could dominate terrain quickly became indispensable. By the time Allied forces pushed into the Central Pacific, places like Bougainville, New Britain, and later Leyte, the doctrine had subtly changed. Infantry advanced with machine guns forward, not behind. Fire superiority came first. Movement followed. Japanese commanders noticed. Some attempted countermeasures, deeper bunkers, angled firing ports, dispersed positions. But the environment worked against them. Jungle warfare compressed distances. Engagements happened suddenly. There was rarely time to adapt once contact was made, and so, the reputation of the Thunder Machine grew, not through propaganda, but through repetition. Encounter after encounter reinforced the same lesson. Once it opened fire, the fight changed shape. The M1919 did not win the war on its own, but it altered the emotional equation of battle, and as both sides adjusted to this new reality, the conflict entered a phase where psychology, technology, and terrain collided with brutal efficiency, setting the stage for moments of decision that would define entire campaigns for the men behind the M1919. War was no longer an abstract concept of strategy or maps. It was weight, heat, noise, and responsibility. The gun itself weighed over 30 pounds without ammunition. Add the tripod, spare barrel, belts of .30-06, and the burden became personal. Every step through mud or jungle was a negotiation between exhaustion and duty, yet when contact came, the weight vanished. Adrenaline took over. Gunners described a narrowing of the world, a tunnel of sound and recoil. The trigger depressed, the weapon bucked, and the jungle answered back. In those moments, fear did not disappear. It focused. The M1919 became a barrier between life and death, and the man behind it knew that if he stopped firing, others would fall. There was also a strange intimacy in its use. The gunner could feel the rhythm of the mechanism through the grips. He could sense when the belt fed cleanly or when friction increased. The weapon spoke in vibrations and sound, and experienced crews listened. For riflemen advancing behind it, the gun's presence was psychological armor. They trusted its sound more than orders shouted through chaos. When it fired, they moved. When it stopped, they froze, but this reliance came with pressure. Machine gun crews were prime targets. Japanese tactics often prioritized eliminating them first, using snipers or sudden close assaults. The gunners knew this. Every burst revealed their position. Every second behind the trigger invited return fire, yet the altered ammunition changed that balance. The explosive impacts discouraged direct rushes. It forced hesitation. And in war, hesitation saved lives. In the Pacific, terrain could not always be shaped with bulldozers or artillery. It had to be shaped with fire. The M1919, especially when loaded with mixed ammunition, allowed American units to redefine how they controlled space. Instead of advancing to seize ground, they could deny it. A ridgeline, a tree line, a ravine, all could be rendered temporarily uninhabitable. This marked a shift from linear warfare to zone control. Fire lanes were drawn not on maps, but in the minds of platoon leaders. The goal was not destruction but dominance, making movement impossible for the enemy without ever seeing them. Japanese doctrine emphasized infiltration and close combat, but this depended on concealment and patience. The modified use of the M1919 disrupted both. Explosive impacts shattered the illusion of safety. A position that had taken hours to prepare could be compromised in seconds. Tactically, this forced Japanese units to spread out further, reducing coordination. Small groups operated independently, which weakened counterattacks. Communication suffered. Commanders lost cohesion. For American units, this fragmentation was an opportunity. Patrols advanced in bounds, always anchored by machine gun fire. If resistance stiffened, the gun spoke first. The battlefield became layered, not by distance, but by fear. Areas under the gun's reach were psychologically closed to the enemy. The M1919 was not designed for jungle warfare, nor for experimental ammunition. But war rarely respects design intentions. The Browning's reliability allowed it to endure conditions that would cripple more delicate weapons. Mud, rain, heat, none of it stopped the action for long. This reliability gave soldiers confidence to push boundaries. Ammunition belts became carefully arranged sequences rather than uniform feeds. Gunners learned which rounds to place where, how many to mix, and when to conserve. These practices were unofficial, often undocumented, but widely adopted. Maintenance became a ritual. Barrels were cooled, swapped, cleaned obsessively. A jam during an engagement could mean annihilation. Crews practiced clearing stoppages in the dark, under stress, by touch alone. This blend of industrial design and human adaptation defined the Pacific War. Technology did not replace the soldier. It amplified him, and as the M1919 thundered across islands and jungles, its role expanded beyond weaponry. It became a signal of presence, of dominance, of survival. The enemy listened. They learned. And they adjusted, which would lead to moments where firepower alone was no longer enough, moments where leadership, timing, and resolve would decide everything. In the Pacific, leadership was not exercised from rear command posts. It existed forward, often within shouting distance of the enemy. Officers and senior NCOs learned quickly that authority meant little without visibility. They had to be seen, heard, felt. The M1919 reshaped that responsibility. A platoon leader no longer simply directed movement, he orchestrated fire. Decisions were made in seconds: when to unleash the gun, when to silence it, when to shift its cone of influence to protect a flank or open a path forward. Leadership became a matter of timing. Fire too early, and the enemy melted away only to reappear elsewhere. Fire too late, and the initiative was lost. The presence of explosive or incendiary rounds increased this pressure. Once fired, escalation was inevitable. Veteran officers understood this. They learned to read the jungle not as terrain, but as behavior, listening for silence that lingered too long, watching for birds that suddenly lifted, sensing when the air itself felt wrong. The M1919 was their punctuation mark. Japanese commanders, equally seasoned, responded with cunning rather than brute force. They avoided direct engagement where possible, instead probing flanks, testing reactions. They sought to draw out fire, identify gun positions, and then neutralize them with mortars or infiltrators. Thus, the machine gun became both a shield and a beacon. Its power demanded use, but its voice revealed its location. Leadership meant accepting that trade-off and deciding when the risk was worth the reward. For Japanese soldiers, trained in endurance and spiritual resolve, the American approach felt alien. Firepower replaced proximity. Distance replaced honor. Yet effectiveness could not be denied. Accounts from surviving veterans and post-war interrogations describe a growing sense of unpredictability. Traditional cues, muzzle flashes, rifle cracks, the rhythm of small arms, no longer applied. The modified M1919 sounded different. It behaved differently. Men spoke of rounds that burst the jungle open, of cover that betrayed them, of comrades struck not by direct hits, but by fragments and splinters accelerated by impact. This altered behavior. Movement slowed. Units waited longer before advancing. Initiative, once a hallmark of Japanese infantry, began to erode. Psychologically, this mattered. The doctrine of aggressive offense depended on momentum. Once hesitation crept in, the entire structure weakened. It was not fear in the simple sense. It was uncertain. And uncertainty kills morale faster than casualties. The use of overwhelming firepower carried moral weight. American soldiers were aware of the destruction they inflicted. Jungle combat removed distance. Screams were audible, faces sometimes visible. The results were not abstract. Some soldiers later spoke of discomfort, of moments when the weapon felt too powerful, of nights replaying the sound of impacts in their minds. Yet the alternative was often worse. Close combat meant bayonets, grenades, and hand-to-hand fighting. The machine gun, for all its violence, kept its distance. It reduced the need for proximity. The fight ended quickly. This moral tension defined much of the Pacific War. Efficiency versus humanity. Survival versus restraint. The M1919 did not resolve this tension. It embodied it. As the campaigns pushed forward into 1944, the stakes rose higher. Battles grew larger. Resistance hardened. And the lessons learned in the jungles would soon be tested on a far greater scale, where entire islands would hinge on moments of overwhelming firepower. What began as adaptation would soon become doctrine, and in that transition lay the turning point of the war in the Pacific. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a phase where hesitation meant defeat. The island-hopping strategy had narrowed the battlefield, forcing confrontations that could no longer be avoided or bypassed. Places like Biak, Saipan, Peleliu, and later Letta became crucibles, compressed spaces where firepower, endurance, and will collided at close range. Here, the M1919 and its evolving role reached a decisive moment. On these islands, terrain worked against everyone. Coral ridges shattered shells unpredictably. Heat drained strength within minutes. There was no room to maneuver, only to endure or advance. Japanese defenses were deeper now, layered and interconnected. Caves, bunkers, and spider holes formed entire underground networks. Traditional suppression was often ineffective. Bullets struck rock and vanished. Artillery could not always reach concealed positions. Flame weapons were limited and dangerous to deploy. What remained was sustained control violence during assaults on fortified ridgelines. M1919 crews were pushed forward, sometimes within yards of enemy positions. Their mission was no longer simple suppression. It was collapse. Collapse of morale. Collapse of coordination. Collapse of resistance. When mixed belts were used, the effect multiplied. A burst would strike a rock face, flash, fragment, shock. Another would tear through brush, splintering cover. A third would detonate against packed earth, throwing debris inward. The effect was cumulative. The enemy could not predict where safety ended. De Peleliu. Marines reported that Japanese defenders abandoned carefully prepared positions after sustained machine gun fire made them untenable. Not destroyed, abandoned. The difference mattered. It signaled psychological defeat. The sound itself became a weapon. Unlike artillery, which arrived in waves, the M1919 was continuous, relentless, intimate. It pressed against the senses without pause, for American units pinned down by interlocking fields of fire. The moment the machine gun opened up marked a shift. Men rose from cover. The medics moved. Platoon leaders advanced. The battle tilted. This was the turning point, not of a single engagement, but of an approach to warfare. Fire superiority was no longer about overwhelming volume alone. It was about control. About shaping the enemy's choices until none remained. Japanese counterattacks still came. Sometimes at night. Sometimes with terrifying resolve. But increasingly, they broke before reaching their targets. Fire cut through formations. Momentum died before contact. Reports from late 1944 reveal a pattern. Resistance stiffened briefly, then collapsed suddenly. The machine gun had become the fulcrum, yet this escalation carried consequences. Ammunition expenditure soared. Barrels burned out. Crews suffered exhaustion. Some gunners described a sense of detachment, firing not at enemies, but at spaces where enemies might be. The war had become abstract, yet more lethal than ever. As Allied forces pushed toward the Philippines and prepared for the invasion of Japan itself. Commanders studied these battles closely. The lesson was clear. Future fighting would depend on overwhelming, immediate firepower at the smallest unit level, and they, M1919, once a supporting tool, had become a decisive instrument, but the story was not finished. The final phase would reveal what this transformation meant, not just for victory, but for the men who carried it forward, and the world that would emerge afterward. By the time Allied forces reached the Philippines in late 1944, the transformation of infantry warfare was complete. Leyte was not merely a landing, it was a test. A proving ground where doctrine, technology, and endurance collided under the weight of expectation. The Japanese Imperial Army had prepared extensively. Terrain was exploited to its limit. Defensive belts were layered, interconnected, and concealed. Every hill was a fortress. Every ravine has a potential kill zone. The defenders understood that they could not defeat the Americans through maneuver alone. Their strategy relied on attrition, on forcing the invaders to bleed for every meter. Yet something had changed. American units no longer advanced blindly. They moved with confidence anchored in firepower. M1919 crews were positioned deliberately, sometimes before infantry even made contact. Their arcs overlapped. Their presence was calculated. When resistance revealed itself, the response was immediate. Gun crews fired not to kill individuals, but to dominate space. Bursts were measured, deliberate, walking across suspected positions. Jungle, rock, and earth erupted in response. The sound rolled continuously, denying the enemy silence, denying them timing. Japanese defenders, trained to wait and strike when the enemy was vulnerable, found no opening. Any movement risked detection. Any sound invited destruction. At times, the jungle itself seemed alive with violence. Trees shed bark in sheets. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The ground trembled under sustained fire. This was no longer an exchange between soldiers. It was an environment engineered for suppression. Accounts from Leyte and later. Luzon described moments where entire defensive lines ceased firing without clear cause. Post-battle analysis revealed abandoned weapons, untriggered ambushes, and positions left intact but empty. The decision to withdraw had been psychological, not tactical. The Thunder Machine had done its work, yet this dominance came at a cost. The intensity of fire placed enormous strain on logistics. Ammunition consumption reached unprecedented levels. Supply chains stretched dangerously thin. In some engagements, gunners fired thousands of rounds in a single day. Barrels warped. Feed mechanisms wore down. Crews rotated constantly to avoid collapse. The physical toll was immense, but the mental strain was worse. Sustained combat without clear endpoints eroded morale. Soldiers spoke of feeling detached, operating the gun as if it was separate from themselves. Still, the advance continued. As American forces closed in on Manila and prepared for the final push toward Japan, the lessons of the Pacific were codified. Training manuals were revised. Doctrine shifted. Fire superiority became foundational. The M1919's role was no longer debated. It was institutionalized, yet even as the weapon proved its value, it forced a reckoning. War had become increasingly impersonal. Distance replaced confrontation. Efficiency replaced valor. The enemy was no longer a figure in front of you, but a shape behind foliage, a shadow in terrain, a coordinate on a map. Victory was now measured in silence, when the guns finally paused, when the jungle stopped echoing with fire. What remained was not triumph, but exhaustion. Entire landscapes were stripped bare. The cost was visible in scorched earth and shattered forests, and invisible in the men who carried those memories home. The turning point had passed. The outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. But the consequences of how it was fought would echo far beyond the final surrender, and in that silence. After the thunder faded, the world stood on the edge of a new era of warfare, one shaped not by courage alone, but by controlled devastation. When the fighting slowed and the front lines finally stabilized, the landscape told a story that words could not. Entire stretches of jungle had been stripped bare. Trees stood splintered and blackened, their trunks scarred by countless impacts. The ground was churned into a mosaic of mud, metal, and ash. This was the physical legacy of a war fought at close range, and of weapons designed to dominate space rather than conquer land. The M1919 had done exactly what it was asked to do. It had allowed small units to exert control far beyond their numbers. It had enabled advances that once would have stalled. And in doing so, it reshaped the outcome of battles across the Pacific. But the aftermath is measured not only in terrain, but in people. For American soldiers, survival often came with a quiet cost. Veterans spoke of the sound first, the way it lingered long after the fighting ended. Some said they could still hear the rhythm of the gun in their sleep, steady and mechanical. Others remembered the smell, burned powder mixed with wet earth. These memories did not fade easily. The psychological burden was complex. Many knew that the weapon had saved their lives. At the same time, they carried the knowledge of what its fire had done. The distance created by machine warfare offered protection, but it also removed intimacy, and with it, clarity. War became something impersonal, yet deeply internal. On the Japanese side, the aftermath was catastrophic. Entire units vanished. Survivors emerged weeks later, starving and disoriented. Many spoke of a battlefield that had become impossible to read. Tactics that once relied on patience and concealment had failed. The environment itself had turned hostile. Post-war debriefings revealed a consistent theme. It was not simply the volume of fire that broke resistance, but its unpredictability. The sense that nowhere was truly safe eroded morale faster than casualties alone. Strategically, the implications were far-reaching. The Pacific Campaign accelerated. Island by island, resistance collapsed more quickly than planners had predicted. The momentum gained from fire superiority shortened campaigns, reduced American casualties overall, and brought the war closer to its conclusion. But this efficiency raised difficult questions. The methods that saved lives on one side exacted an immense toll on the other. The line between necessity and excess blurred. In the years that followed, military doctrine absorbed these lessons. Infantry doctrine across the world shifted toward integrated fire teams, emphasizing suppression, mobility, and psychological dominance. The M1919 became a reference point, not just a weapon, but a case study in how technology reshapes behavior. Its influence extended beyond the battlefield. Cold War militaries studied the Pacific campaigns carefully. New machine guns, lighter and more adaptable, were designed with similar principles in mind. The idea that control of space could be achieved through sustained, precise fire became foundational, yet for the men who had carried it, these abstractions mattered little. What remained were memories of heat, noise, fear, and the strange comfort of a weapon that worked when nothing else did. As the world moved on, the jungle slowly reclaimed the scars of war. Trees grew where trenches once lay. Birds returned to places once filled with gunfire. But the lessons endured, and they would shape not only future conflicts, but how humanity understood the cost of mastering destruction. As the war moved toward its final chapters, the legacy of the Pacific campaigns followed every planning table and briefing room. The experience gained in jungle warfare reshaped military thinking far beyond the islands where it was born. What had once been seen as improvisation became doctrine. What began as adaptation became standard practice. The M1919, once an auxiliary support weapon, was now studied as a model of battlefield influence. Not because of innovation in its mechanics, it was, by then, an aging design, but because of how humans learned to wield it. The lesson was clear. Control of terrain did not require occupation. It required dominance of movement. This understanding carried into post-war doctrine across the United States and its allies. Fire and maneuver became inseparable concepts. Infantry no longer advanced hoping to overpower resistance. They advanced under the umbrella of suppression. This philosophy would later define Cold War conflicts from Korea to Vietnam. Yet the human cost lingered quietly. Many veterans returned home with no language for what they had experienced. They spoke of exhaustion more than fear, of numbness rather than heroism. The memory of continuous firing, of holding the trigger while the world in front of them disappeared, haunted their sleep. For some, the weapon became a symbol of survival. For others, a reminder of things they wished to forget. Japanese survivors carried their own burdens. The collapse of defensive doctrine forced a painful reckoning. The belief in spiritual endurance over material power had met a limit. Post-war military thinkers in Japan studied these battles not to glorify them, but to understand the cost of inflexibility. The Pacific War had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. Modern warfare no longer rewarded courage alone. It demanded adaptability, logistics, and psychological dominance. In the years that followed, historians would debate whether the devastation had been avoidable, whether different choices, different doctrines, might have spared lives. But history does not grant revisions, only lessons. The jungles where the M1919 once thundered slowly healed. Vegetation swallowed shell craters. Rain erased tracks. Silence returned, yet the echoes remained, not in sound, but in doctrine, memory, and warning. The machine gun did not win the war alone, but it revealed something fundamental about the future of conflict. That technology, once unleashed, reshapes not just battlefields, but the people who fight upon them. And so, when the last shots faded and the world exhaled, what remained was a sobering understanding that power, once mastered, carries a responsibility far heavier than the weapon itself. The thunder had passed, but the lesson endured. When the war finally ended, the world stood still long enough to listen to what the silence revealed. The thunder that once rolled through jungles and valleys had faded, but its meaning lingered, not as triumph, but as memory. The story of the M1919 in the Pacific is not merely a story of a weapon. It is a story about transformation, how necessity reshapes ethics, how fear accelerates innovation, and how survival redefines morality. What began as a machine built for support became a symbol of dominance, not because of its design, but because of how humans learned to use it. The jungles of the Pacific. Warfare became intimate and impersonal at the same time. Soldiers fought enemies they could rarely see, guided by sound, movement, and instinct. The machine gun became their voice, speaking in bursts of fire where words failed. It protected, destroyed, and decided outcomes in seconds. Yet history remembers not only what wins wars, but what wars leave behind. The legacy of those battles is written not just in military doctrine, but in quiet moments, in veterans who carried memories they could not easily share, and in landscapes that slowly healed over scars made by steel and flame. The lessons of that era endure because they are uncomfortable. They remind us that technology amplifies intent, that efficiency can coexist with tragedy, that progress in warfare often arrives long before wisdom catches up. The M1919 did not shape the future because it was powerful. It did so because it revealed how power changes those who wield it, and in that understanding lies the final truth of the thunder machine. That the most lasting impact of war is not the sound of the gunfire, but the silence that follows, and what humanity chooses to remember within it.